My parents beat my 8 years old daughter with a wooden paddle over an accident. So I took my revenge and now they are begging. Buckle up, Reddit. This is going to be a wild ride through family drama, revenge, and what happens when grandparents think they're above the law. I'm 36 million, and this story is about how I went from dutiful son to their worst nightmare in about 6 months flat. This isn't just about family dysfunction. This is about what happens when child abusers mess with the wrong parent. Me, 36 male, works in supply chain logistics, makes around $95,000, which is decent but nothing crazy. Been with the company for 8 years, working my way up from entry-level coordinator to senior logistics manager. Married to Jessica, 34 female, who's a physical therapist pulling in about $68,000. She specializes in pediatric therapy, which makes what happened even more twisted. We've got one daughter, Lily, who's 8 years old and basically the reason I get up every morning. My parents, Rick, 67 male, construction worker his whole life, thinks yelling louder makes you more right, and believes that anything wrong with the world is because kids aren't getting hit enough. Patricia, 64 female, former secretary at a law firm, developed serious entitlement after coming into money. Both worship at the church of respect your elders, even when the elders are complete disasters. My younger brother Derek, 33 male, mechanic who still lives in their shadow and thinks our parents walk on water. Classic golden child who never learned to think for himself. Never been married, partially because he's never met a woman who could compete with his mommy for attention. Lives 10 minutes from our parents and shows up for dinner 3 times a week. Now here's where this gets interesting, and where you can really see how this whole mess started brewing. About 5 years ago, my parents struck what they thought was gold. Mom's boss at the law firm kicked the bucket and supposedly left her $180,000 in his will. Apparently, this old dude had no family, and mom had been handling his personal stuff for years, paying his bills, organizing his medical appointments, that sort of thing. The money went straight to their heads. Suddenly, these blue-collar folks were acting like they'd joined the country club. New house, new cars, dad got a shiny pickup, mom got an SUV that cost more than my salary, and attitudes that could cut glass. Mom especially turned into this insufferable person who looked down on anyone with less money than them. She started shopping at the expensive grocery store across town, started buying designer purses and getting her nails done weekly, joined some women's club at their church, and started acting like she was better than other members. Dad wasn't much better. Suddenly, he was the expert on everything. Here's the thing, though. Me and Jessica were struggling financially. We'd bought our house right before the market exploded, had student loans from Jessica's degree, and Jessica's car had died requiring a $4,800 repair we couldn't afford. When my parents offered childcare help, it seemed like a blessing. They'd watch Lily every Monday and Wednesday, saving us about $400 monthly in daycare costs. But there was always this underlying tension. Mom would make passive-aggressive comments about how we couldn't afford things, and how lucky we were to have successful parents who could bail us out. She'd buy Lily expensive toys, and then make pointed comments about how some parents can't provide properly for their children. Dad was different but equally annoying. Constant lectures about being a man and providing for your family, and endless comparisons to Derek, who in his mind was perfect because he never questioned anything. He'd make comments about how real men don't let their wives work, how I should be making more money, how I was soft compared to his generation. The worst part was how they treated Jessica. Mom would make snide comments about how physical therapists aren't real doctors, and how Jessica was wasting her time helping disabled kids. Dad would ignore Jessica completely during family gatherings. They made it clear Jessica was beneath them. The breaking point had been building for months. Mom was getting more and more controlling with Lily, making comments about how we were too soft on her and how children need structure and discipline. She'd contradict our parenting decisions right in front of Lily, telling her things like, "Grandma knows better than mommy and daddy," when we'd make decisions about bedtime or snacks. Jessica and I had agreed early on that we weren't going to use physical punishment. Timeouts, loss of privileges, natural consequences. We'd both grown up getting hit and didn't want that for Lily. Our pediatrician supported our approach, Jessica's training supported it, and it was working great. Lily was well-behaved and confident, but my parents hated our approach. They'd make comments about how we were raising a spoiled brat and how Lily would never learn respect without getting spanked. Mom would say things like, "A good swat never hurt anyone," and Dad would go on about how kids today have no discipline because parents are too weak to do what needs to be done. I've got this buddy at work who kept warning me about this situation. He's this no-nonsense guy who calls things like he sees them, always cracking jokes and calling people out on their garbage. He'd been hearing me complain about my parents for months and kept saying, dude, they're gonna overstep eventually, and when they do, you need to be ready to drop the hammer. He had this saying that stuck with me: respect is earned, not demanded. And people who demand respect usually deserve none. He kept warning me that my parents were testing boundaries and that I needed to set them straight before something bad happened. He'd seen this pattern before with his own in-laws and knew how these things escalated. I should have listened to him. I should have cut off the free babysitting and found another solution. But we needed the help, and I kept thinking I could manage the situation. Classic mistake: trying to manage manipulative people instead of just cutting them off. Last month, Jessica picked up some weekend shifts at her clinic. The facility was short-staffed, and they were offering time and a half for weekend coverage. We needed the extra cash desperately because our furnace had just died, and we were looking at a $3,200 repair bill that might as well have been $32,000 for all the money we had lying around. Winter was coming, and we couldn't wait. My parents offered to keep Lily for a long weekend while I dealt with some urgent inventory issues at work. We had a major shipment coming in from overseas that had been delayed, and I needed to coordinate with multiple suppliers to prevent a production shutdown. It seemed like perfect timing. I dropped Lily off Friday night around 6 p.m., and she was excited because Mom had promised to take her to the new indoor trampoline park that had just opened across town and teach her how to make homemade pizza from scratch. Lily hugged me goodbye and ran inside to show Dad her new art project from school, a painting of our family that she was particularly proud of. Everything seemed normal. Mom was in a good mood. Dad was watching his usual TV shows, and Lily was chattering away about her week at school. I reminded them about Lily's bedtime routine, her mild allergy to strawberries, and that she needed to practice her piano for 20 minutes each day. Standard stuff. Saturday went fine as far as I knew. I was swamped at work dealing with shipping containers and customs paperwork, but I called around 8 p.m. to check in. Mom answered and said everything was great. They'd had a blast at the trampoline park, Lily had helped make pizza for dinner, and she was being such a good girl. They'd watched a movie together, and Lily was already in her pajamas getting ready for bed. Nothing seemed off at all. Sunday morning around 10:30 a.m., my phone rang while I was reviewing inventory reports. It was Mom, but her voice was completely different, cold and nasty in a way that reminded me of how she talked to customer service people when she was ticked off. The kind of voice that immediately puts you on edge. "You need to come get Lily right now," she said, without any greeting. "Her behavior has become completely unacceptable, and we're done dealing with it." I asked what happened, and she goes, "She destroyed our master bathroom and then had the audacity to lie to our faces about it. We've tried to correct her behavior, but she's being defiant and disrespectful. This is what happens when children aren't properly disciplined." I'm thinking maybe Lily had an accident or spilled something, so I told my parents I'd be right over to help clean up whatever mess she'd made. I was already grabbing my keys, expecting to find soap on the floor, or maybe a broken towel rack. Kid stuff, you know? When I walked into their house, the atmosphere was like a funeral. My parents were sitting at their kitchen table, looking like they were about to sentence someone to death. Dad had his arms crossed and was doing that thing where he stares you down to assert dominance. Mom had her lips pursed in that disapproving way that meant someone was in serious trouble. "Where's Lily?" I asked, looking around the living room. "She's in timeout upstairs, thinking about what she did," Dad said in this authoritative voice that immediately rubbed me the wrong way, like he was some kind of judge pronouncing a verdict. What exactly did she do that was so terrible? That's when Mom launched into this dramatic story about how Lily had been playing with the fancy soap dispenser in their master bathroom, some $80 automatic thing she'd bought to show off to her church friends. Lily was trying to make bubbles in the sink like she does at home and accidentally knocked it over, breaking it and spilling soap everywhere. "That's it?" I asked, genuinely confused. "She broke a soap dispenser by accident?" Mom's face got red, and that vein in her forehead started throbbing. "It wasn't an accident. She was being careless and destructive. And then when we told her she was in trouble, she looked us right in the eye and said, 'But I didn't mean to,' like she was arguing with us. The disrespect was unbelievable." I'm standing there thinking, so my 8-year-old daughter had an accident and then accurately explained what happened. She told the truth about it being unintentional. Where exactly was the problem here? "She needed to learn that actions have consequences," Dad said, standing up to make himself look more intimidating. "So we gave her a proper spanking and put her in timeout to think about what she'd done. Maybe now she'll understand that being careless and disrespectful has consequences." My blood went cold. The room seemed to tilt sideways. "What do you mean by proper spanking?" Mom got this entitled smirk on her face, like she was proud of what they'd done. "We bent her over the bed and gave her 10 good swats with a wooden paddle. Maybe now she'll think twice before being destructive and disrespectful in our house. Children need to learn respect. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The words hit me like physical blows. You did what? Don't you raise your voice at us? Mom snapped, pointing her finger at me like I was a child. We've been far too lenient with that child, and it's time she learned some respect. You've been too soft on her, and look where it's gotten us. I pushed past them and ran upstairs to find Lily, taking the steps two at a time. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking. She was in my old bedroom, standing in the corner facing the wall with her hands at her sides. When she heard me come in, she turned around, and I'll never forget what I saw. Her face was red and puffy from crying. Her nose was running and her eyes were swollen. She looked absolutely terrified, like she'd been through something traumatic. But the worst part was how her whole body relaxed when she saw me, like she'd been rescued from something horrible. Daddy! She sobbed and ran to me. I picked her up and she wrapped her arms around my neck so tight I could barely breathe. She was shaking like a leaf, and I could feel her little heart hammering against my chest. I didn't mean to break it, Daddy, she kept saying through her tears. I was just trying to make pretty bubbles like Mommy showed me at home. I told them it was an accident, but they said I was lying. I wasn't lying, Daddy. I promise I wasn't lying. She was hiccuping from crying so hard and kept repeating that she hadn't meant to break anything. The desperation in her voice broke my heart. My confident, happy little girl had been reduced to this terrified, shaking child who was begging me to believe her. I was trying to calm her down when my parents appeared in the doorway. Mom had the nerve to say, "Don't fall for the crocodile tears. She's just trying to manipulate you. She knows exactly what she did wrong." That's when I lost my cool completely. She's 8 years old. She had an accident and you beat her for it. Dad stepped forward, trying to intimidate me in my own childhood bedroom. We disciplined her appropriately. That child has been spoiled rotten and she needs to learn respect. If you're not going to do your job as a father, then we will. Someone has to teach her right from wrong. This isn't discipline, this is abuse, I shot back, holding Lily tighter. You're being dramatic, Mom said with an eye roll. We got spanked as children, and we turned out fine. This generation is too soft. Lily needs to learn that actions have consequences. I told them they were never watching Lily again, and if they ever touched her again, I'd call the police. Mom started this fake crying act about how they were just trying to help and how ungrateful I was. Dad said I was raising a weak, disrespectful brat, and that I was too soft to be a real man. Get out of our house, Dad said, and don't come back until you're ready to apologize for disrespecting us in our own home. I took Lily home immediately, carrying her to the car while she clung to me. She didn't let go of my hand the entire drive home and kept asking if I was mad at her. I had to keep reassuring her that she hadn't done anything wrong. That night, while giving her a bath, I saw the bruises on her bottom and thighs. Dark purple marks in the clear shape of a paddle. Some were turning yellow around the edges where the blood was pooling under the skin. My little girl looked like she'd been beaten by a criminal, because that's exactly what had happened. I took photos with my phone, my hands shaking as I documented the evidence. Each picture made me angrier. These weren't light marks from a quick swat. These were serious bruises that showed how hard they'd hit her. I called my buddy immediately. He came over within an hour, took one look at the pictures, and said, "Dude, you're calling the cops right now. This is assault. I don't care if they're your parents. This is criminal." Our pediatrician saw us first thing Monday morning. I'd called as soon as they opened and explained the situation. She was horrified when she saw Lily. She said in 15 years of practice, she'd never seen bruising that severe from a spanking. She documented everything with official medical photos and filed a mandatory report with Child Protective Services. The bruises were so bad that our doctor actually asked me multiple times if I was sure it was my parents and not me or Jessica who had done this. She said the level of force required to cause that kind of damage was concerning and excessive by any reasonable standard. She also noted that Lily was showing signs of trauma. She was clingy, jumpy, and kept asking if she was in trouble. When CPS contacted my parents 2 days later, they went absolutely ballistic. They called me screaming about how I was destroying the family and attacking innocent grandparents. Mom kept shrieking about how they'd sacrificed everything to help us, and this was how I repaid them. "We were trying to help you," Mom screamed into the phone. "We were doing your job as parents because you're too weak to do it yourself, and this is the thanks we get?" Dad said I was a worthless son who was ruining their reputation over nothing. He said if I didn't drop the whole thing immediately, there would be consequences and I'd regret making enemies out of family. Derek called me that same day, absolutely furious. "What the heck is wrong with you?" he said. "Mom and Dad are devastated. They were just trying to help discipline Lily, and you're treating them like criminals. You're tearing this family apart over nothing. I tried to explain about the bruises, but he cut me off. We got spanked as kids and we turned out fine. You're being a drama queen and making this into something it's not. Mom and Dad would never hurt Lily. They love her more than anything. When I offered to show him the photos, he refused to look at them. I don't need to see anything. I know Mom and Dad, and I know you're overreacting. Then the extended family got involved. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all calling to tell me I was overreacting and destroying the family over nothing. My mom's sister actually said I was lucky to have parents who cared enough to discipline Lily properly. Most grandparents would just let her run wild, she said. My dad's brother said I was raising Lily to be weak and that I should be thanking my parents for stepping up when I was failing as a father. The gaslighting was incredible. Suddenly, I was the problem for protecting my daughter from abuse. But here's where it gets interesting. My buddy had been doing some digging. The guy's got connections from his previous job in insurance investigation. He found out that my parents had been bragging all over town about their wealth and successful family. They'd been telling people at their church, their neighbors, basically anyone who would listen, about how they were helping their son's family and what wonderful grandparents they were. Your parents have been building this whole image, he told me. They've got a reputation to protect now, and reputations can be destroyed. The CPS investigation concluded that while the punishment was excessive, it didn't rise to the level of criminal abuse since it was a one-time incident with no prior reports. They recommended family counseling and parenting classes for my parents if they wanted any future contact with Lily. My parents refused. They said they wouldn't be treated like criminals and that CPS had no right to interfere with grandparents' rights. They demanded I drop the whole thing and act like an adult. We're not the ones who need counseling, Mom said during one particularly nasty phone call. You need to get your head on straight and stop attacking your own family. When I refused, they started their manipulation campaign. They began sending Lily cards and gifts with messages like, Grandma and Grandpa miss you, and we love you even though Daddy won't let us see you. They'd show up at Lily's school, her soccer games, the grocery store, anywhere they thought they could corner us and force a confrontation. After 2 months of this nonsense, I sent them a cease and desist letter through a lawyer. That stopped the direct stalking behavior, but they ramped up the family pressure instead. Every family gathering became about me. My cousin's wedding, my uncle's birthday party. They'd show up crying about their stolen granddaughter and how I was destroying an innocent family. They'd corner other family members and show them fake text messages they claimed were from me, saying horrible things about them. They'd tell people that Jessica was controlling me and turning me against my family. The lies were endless and creative. The family started excluding me and Jessica from events, saying our presence caused drama. Then, they'd send guilt trips about how we were missing out on family time and depriving Lily of her extended family. It was a coordinated campaign to isolate us and force us to give in. Derek escalated things when he confronted me at work. He cornered me in the parking lot after my shift and said I was being a child and destroying Mom and Dad's lives over nothing. He said if I didn't fix this situation, he'd consider taking legal action for grandparent visitation rights. They're getting older, he said. They might not have much time left with Lily. You're stealing that from them over some stupid misunderstanding. When I told him to back off, he actually grabbed my arm and said, You need to remember what family loyalty means. Blood is thicker than water. That's when I knew they were all completely delusional. They'd convinced themselves that beating a child was acceptable and that I was the problem for protecting her. But the final straw was when my parents sent a letter directly to Lily at school. Somehow they'd gotten it past the front office, and it ended up in her backpack. It said they were very sick and might not have much time left and wanted to see their precious granddaughter one last time. Lily found it before I did and came home crying, asking if her grandparents were going to die. She was 8 years old and they were using her emotions against her to manipulate the situation. I had to explain that they weren't actually sick. They were just trying to trick her into wanting to see them. That's when I realized these people would use my daughter's emotions against her to get what they wanted. They didn't care about her well-being at all. My buddy said, That's it, man. Game over. Time to go nuclear. Here's where my buddy really proved his worth. The guy had been quietly gathering information about my parents for months, and what he found was incredible. He'd been talking to people at their church, their neighbors, even some of Mom's former coworkers at the law firm. Turns out my parents had been telling everyone a completely different story. They'd been saying that Jessica and I were drug addicts who were neglecting Lily, and that they'd had to step in to protect their granddaughter. They claimed I was mentally unstable and violent, and that they were afraid for Lily's safety in our home. Mom had been telling people at church that she was essentially raising her granddaughter because her son was unfit and that they were the only stable influence in Lily's life. She'd been collecting donations from church members to help with legal fees to fight for custody of Lily. She had a whole sob story about how CPS was persecuting innocent grandparents. Dad had been telling his construction buddies that I was a weak liberal who was feminizing Lily and that they needed to teach her how to be tough because I was raising her to be soft. He'd been saying that Jessica was controlling me and that I'd lost my backbone when I got married. But the best part? My buddy discovered that my parents had been lying about their finances too. Remember that $180,000 inheritance? They'd blown through most of it on stupid purchases and were actually drowning in debt. The new house? They'd taken out a huge mortgage they could barely afford on Dad's construction income. The new cars? Financed at high interest rates because their credit wasn't great to begin with. They'd been living this fantasy lifestyle they couldn't actually afford, and their entire social status was built on lies and borrowed money. The fancy soap dispenser that Lily broke? They'd put it on a credit card they were already maxed out on. Their house poor and reputation rich, my buddy said. Time to flip that equation. But here's where it gets really interesting. My buddy also found out something else through his insurance connections. Mom's former boss at the law firm? The one who supposedly left her $180,000? His family had been looking for that money for years. Turns out there were some serious irregularities in how Mom had handled his estate, and the family had suspected she'd stolen money but could never prove it. The old lawyer had been suffering from early-stage dementia in his final years, and Mom had been taking advantage of his condition. She'd been forging his signature on checks, using his credit cards for personal purchases, and had manipulated him into changing his will while he wasn't mentally competent. Your mom might be a thief, my buddy said, and thieves don't like attention. We also discovered that several of Mom's former co-workers at the law firm had suspected something was wrong. She'd been handling the old lawyer's personal finances, and they'd noticed expensive purchases that didn't make sense for someone his age with dementia, but they'd never reported it because Mom was such a trusted employee. My buddy had contacts everywhere from his insurance investigation days, and he'd been building a case against my parents like he was preparing for trial. He had documentation of their lies, evidence of their financial problems, and connections to people who could verify everything. I decided it was time to stop playing defense and go on the offensive. With my buddy's help, I started methodically destroying the fake reputation my parents had built. This wasn't going to be some emotional outburst. This was going to be calculated and thorough. First, I reached out to everyone in their social circle: church members, neighbors, Dad's construction buddies, Mom's former coworkers. I showed them the photos of Lily's bruises and told them the real story. I explained how my parents had been lying about our family situation and manipulating people for sympathy and money. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Their church was horrified. The pastor called me personally to apologize and said the congregation had been deceived by my parents' lies. Several members who had donated money to my parents' legal fund demanded refunds. The church treasurer was furious that they'd been used to collect money under false pretenses. The pastor asked my parents to take a break from their volunteer activities while they sorted things out. Mom had been running the children's ministry fundraisers, and Dad had been helping with church maintenance. Both positions were quietly given to other people. Their neighbors were disgusted. These were people who had been impressed by my parents' sudden success and family values. They'd been invited to barbecues where my parents would brag about their wonderful family and how they were helping raise their granddaughter. Finding out they were child abusers who lied about their own son completely shattered their image. The neighbor who lived next door said she'd always thought something was off about how my parents talked about me and Jessica. Another neighbor said she was sick, that she'd trusted them around her own grandchildren. Dad's construction buddies turned on him hard. These are tough guys who don't mess around when it comes to child abuse. They've got their own kids and grandkids, and the idea of beating an 8-year-old with a paddle over an accident was unforgivable to them. Word spread through the local construction community that Dad was a child beater, and suddenly he couldn't get work anymore. Construction is a tight-knit community where reputation matters, and Dad's reputation was destroyed overnight. Contractors stopped calling him for jobs, and the few who did were only offering the worst, lowest-paying work. But the real nuclear bomb was what happened with the inheritance money. I contacted the deceased lawyer's family and provided them with all the information my buddy had gathered. They were grateful. They'd suspected something was wrong, but hadn't known how to prove it. They hired a forensic accountant to investigate how Mom had handled the estate, and what they found was damning. Mom had been stealing money from her boss for years before he died. She'd been forging his signature on checks, using his credit cards for personal purchases, and had manipulated him into changing his will while he was suffering from dementia. The forensic accountant found evidence of over $200,000 in stolen money, not just the $180,000 inheritance. Mom had been systematically robbing this poor old man while pretending to care for him. She'd used his credit cards to buy her fancy purse collection, her expensive car, even some of the furniture in their new house. The family filed criminal charges against Mom for elder abuse, theft, fraud, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The police arrested her at their house during the middle of the day in front of all the neighbors who came out to watch. The local newspaper ran a story about the trusted secretary who stole from elderly employer with Mom's mugshot on the front page. Dad lost his job completely because no one in town wanted to hire someone associated with a thief and child abuser. Word traveled fast in their small social circles. They couldn't make their mortgage payments, and the bank started foreclosure proceedings within 3 months. They had to sell both their cars just to pay for Mom's legal fees, but it wasn't enough. They moved into a terrible apartment in the worst part of town, the kind of place they used to look down on when they were living high and mighty. But the best part? Derek finally saw them for what they really were. When he found out about the stolen money and saw the photos of Lily's bruises, photos I finally forced him to look at, he cut contact with them completely. "I can't believe I defended them," he told me during a tearful phone call. "I can't believe I thought you were the problem. Those bruises. Oh my God. What did they do to her?" Derek actually called me to apologize and said he'd been brainwashed by them for years. He said living under their influence was like being in a cult. Everything they said was gospel, and questioning them was forbidden. He'd never learned to think for himself because they'd controlled every aspect of his life. 3 weeks ago, Mom called me from jail. She was crying and barely coherent. "Please," she sobbed into the phone. "We're destitute, and we have nowhere to turn. I'll do anything, anything, to see Lily again. I'll admit we were wrong. I'll go to counseling. I'll do whatever you want." She begged me to forgive them and said they'd learned their lesson the hard way. She actually offered to sign over custody rights to me completely if I would just help them get back on their feet. Then Dad got on the phone and did something I'd never heard him do in my entire life. He begged. This man who had spent my whole childhood telling me that real men don't cry was sobbing into the phone like a child. "I was wrong about everything," he said. "I was wrong about you, wrong about Jessica, wrong about how to treat Lily. I know I messed up. I know we messed up, but we're family. Please don't let us lose everything over this." He said they'd lost everything, and I was their only hope. He promised they'd never touch Lily again, never even ask to see her if I didn't want them to. He just wanted me to call off the dogs and stop the prosecution. I listened to them grovel for about 30 seconds before I said, "You should have thought about that before you beat my daughter with a wooden paddle. Actions have consequences, right? Isn't that what you taught her?" Then I hung up. My buddy was laughing his rear end off when I told him about the call. "Dude, you just served them the coldest dish of revenge ever. They went from thinking they were royalty to being social pariahs in 6 months. That's some poetic justice right there." My parents are now facing serious criminal charges. Mom's trial starts next month, and her public defender thinks she'll get 3 to 5 years in prison for the theft and elder abuse charges. The prosecution has a mountain of evidence, and Mom doesn't have money for a good lawyer. Dad is working part-time at a grocery store stocking shelves and can barely afford rent on their crummy apartment. He's 67 years old and his body is breaking down from 40 years of construction work, but no one will hire him for anything better. Their reputation is completely destroyed. They lost their house, their cars, their friends, their church community, and their social standing. Even their own son Derek wants nothing to do with them. They went from being respected members of their community to being known as the child abusers and thieves who got what they deserved. Some extended family members still think I went too far. My dad's sister sent me a nasty letter saying I destroyed innocent people over a misunderstanding, and that I should be ashamed of myself. But here's the thing. These weren't innocent people. They were manipulative thieves who beat a child and then tried to gaslight everyone about it. I've had more family members reach out privately to say they support what I did than I expected. Turns out my parents had been manipulating and controlling people for years, and I wasn't the only one who'd suffered under their leadership. My cousin told me that Mom had been stealing from family gatherings for years, taking leftover food, small items, even cash from purses when people weren't looking. Derek has been working hard on rebuilding our relationship. He said living under their influence was like being in a fog, where you couldn't see clearly. He's been going to therapy to deal with the years of manipulation and control. He's actually thanked me for setting him free from their toxic influence. I feel like I can breathe for the first time in my adult life, he told me. I didn't realize how much they controlled every thought I had. Jessica has been my rock through all of this. She never once questioned whether we were doing the right thing. She said anyone who would hurt our child deserved whatever consequences came their way. Her professional training in child development made her even more horrified by what they'd done. Normal grandparents don't leave bruises like that, she said. Normal grandparents don't beat children for accidents. What they did was abuse, plain and simple. As for my parents, they're learning what it's like to face real consequences for their actions. Mom's trial starts next month, and the prosecutor is confident about a conviction. The evidence is overwhelming, and there are multiple witnesses to testify about her behavior with the elderly lawyer. Dad is essentially unemployable at his age with his reputation. He's lost about 30 pounds from stress and looks like he's aged 10 years and 6 months. They've tried reaching out through other family members, sending messages about how they're sorry and want to make amends, but it's too late for apologies. So, Reddit, am I the a-hole for systematically destroying my parents' lives after they beat my daughter? They went from living high and mighty to being broke criminals who lost everything. Some people might say I went too far, but I sleep great at night, knowing that child abusers got exactly what they deserved.